Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the symposium. I apologize, to Horseshoe Bend National Military Park's annual symposium. I'd really like to say thank you to our partners today here at Pebble Hill, Mabin Beard back there in the back. Thank you so much for everything, Mabin, as always. And also, of course, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for everything that you do. Dr. Wilson was out watering the plants this morning when I got here, so he does a little bit of everything. I'd also like to take this moment to appreciate our partner organization. So I work at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park, and our partners at the Friends of Horseshoe Bend do a lot for us. And I want to just take this moment to recognize there are several members of the group here. They help us do things that we can't do with our regular budget. And they help us with volunteering and just all kinds of things in the background. So friends, if you don't mind, raise your hand if you're a member of the Friends of Horseshoe Bend. Awesome. Thank y'all so much for being here. So again, I'm Stacy. I'm one of the park rangers at Horseshoe Bend, and I was asked to MC this today. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce each speaker, and then at the end of their presentation, there will be a few minutes for question and answer. So that'll be between each speaker rather than at the end. We're going to start today with Dr. Stephen Peach. He is an associate professor of history at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. So he came a long way today. He recently published his first book with the University of Oklahoma Press. It's titled Rivers of Power, Creek Political Culture in the Native South, 1750 to 1815. He's also the author of numerous articles, reviews, and short essays about Native Americans in U.S. history. His presentation today will examine Creek men and women who charted a path of diplomacy with the United States during the Creek War of 1813 and 14. With that, Dr. Peach, thank you.
Right. I can load this computer. All right, thank you for that introduction, Stacy. And thank you to Mark and Mabin for helping to organize this talk. Thanks to Matthew, who I don't believe is here. I've been corresponding with him to set up my end of this presentation. And just thank you for everyone for your attendance. This is a packed room. Normally when I give a paper, there's only a few people at like an academic conference. So it's nice to see a lot of people interested in history in general. And of course, in this case, Creek history, the history of Horseshoe Bend. And yeah, it's just a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out. Let me see if I can load my, there we go, oops. Okay. All right, so my talk is entitled Searching for Peace in the Creek War. There's a lot of historical literature on the history of the Creek War of 1813 and 1814. Most of it, at least from the perspective of Creek Indian history, tends to look at it from the point of view of the Red Sticks, the Creeks who were in active rebellion against the Creek leadership and against the United States. I'll mention the Red Sticks a little bit more later. The vast majority of Creeks during this war participated in or in some way supported the Red Sticks and their movement to essentially get rid of United States influence in Creek affairs, purify the Creek leadership, and put the Creeks on a path of sovereignty and independence. But my own research to some degree looks at a different point of view, a different perspective. It looks at those Creeks who weren't in rebellion against the Creek government and who did kind of chart a path of diplomacy with the United States. So that's essentially what I'll be talking about today, a different kind of point of view here. And I should say, of course, that the Creek War lasted from 1813 to 1814, not to be confused with a different Creek War in the 1830s that preceded the removal of the Creek Indians to Indian Territory, or what became Oklahoma. But again, later on, the Creeks did in fact launch another rebellion against the United States. But before I can really get into the Creek War itself, I do need to give you some background on Creek society, Creek politics, and just the state of Creek country in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So the Creeks lived in a world of local communities, particularly towns and matrilineal clans. There were dozens of Creek towns throughout the 18th century, but they had formed before then. Towns were important social, political, and religious spaces. Each Creek had a kind of social identity that was tied to a particular town. Creeks also belonged to matrilineal clans. So you were related to your mother and your maternal line. Those were the people who raised you. Those were the people who taught you how to farm, how to go to war. Young girls learned how to farm from their mothers and their aunts, for example, whereas young boys learned how to go to war, how to make diplomacy, how to trade with nearby peoples. And they learned that from their uncles or their mother's brother. So matrilineal kinship was an incredibly important component here in Creek country. These different towns in Creek country came together frequently to build political coalitions in order to discuss larger issues having to do with war, diplomacy, and trade. At times, these towns came together in larger provincial coalitions. And in fact, there were 4 different provinces in the Creek country. The Tallapoosa's, for example, were one such province. And I think in this particular space, we're on old Tallapoosa land, but there were a few other provinces as well. At times, those 4 provinces came together to make up the Creek Nation, which was embodied in what was called the National Council. And this is where the Creek leadership passed decisions regarding trade, regarding treaties with colonial powers. This is where decisions were rendered in terms of like maybe punishing warriors for attacking British and American settlements in the 18th century South. So the National Council was a pretty important institution here in Creek country. Rivers, to invoke my book just for a minute here, rivers were an important part of Creek country too. Rivers provided, of course, fresh water for women who grew crops, particularly corn, beans, and squash. Rivers provided water that nourished spiritual life. Rivers were believed to be an important source of spiritual power. I found in my own research that rivers could also be a political metaphor. Now, in fact, rivers were the basis in some cases of political power in Creek country. So when different Creek leaders referred to their provinces, like the Tallapoosa province, they often used the term river. Like our river, our larger community is what makes sense to us. So rivers have a sort of political dimension here in the Creek world. Now the leadership, the Creek leadership, emerged from this community world. And the guiding principle was consensus. This was basically the idea that headmen or leaders met to discuss important issues in both domestic and foreign affairs, and they had to arrive at a consensual decision about what exactly they wanted to do. So power wasn't necessarily coercive. It wasn't forced. Instead, leaders discussed, often at length, about a course of action they wanted to pursue. And these leaders met in the central town square throughout Creek country. There were dozens of towns in this particular area of the American South. And this is where the political business was discussed. Some leaders were in fact ritual or spiritual leaders too. They oversaw the most important ceremony in Creek country, and that was the green corn ceremony, also known as the busk. This was a time when the particular town came together, and it involved men and women, and it kind of reaffirmed the relationship between the Creeks and the Master of Breath, as they referred to their spiritual entity. And finally, the Creeks, like their southeastern Indian neighbors, were enmeshed in a world of like colonial powers. British Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire, and later, of course, the United States. Not to mention various other native populations like the Cherokees, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws. And as a result, the Creeks often waged war with these different peoples, fighting about issues over access to land, water, hunting grounds, access to trade goods. There were a number of issues that sparked war between the Creeks and their native and non-native neighbors. But at the same time, the Creeks were expert diplomats. These political leaders that I've been talking about who exercised influence within their towns and clans also had a kind of diplomatic impact. You know, they're looking out at the world around them, trying to ensure that they could bring peace with these various neighbors around them. But women as well as men shaped this pattern of war and diplomacy. Certainly, we know that women were involved in politics, even just kind of looking on at the political proceedings within a given town. Sometimes women called for retaliation against an enemy. So when the Cherokees, for example, killed a number of Creeks in the middle of the 18th century, it was the responsibility of the women who felt offended, who felt that they had lost loved ones, lost crucial labor within the clan, and therefore they called on all able-bodied men to retaliate and avenge the clan. So retaliation became an important way for women to involve themselves in the shaping of war. But they also called for peace too. They were as much peacemakers as were Creek men. I have the heart of Creek country highlighted there in blue on this map from the 18th century. There are various provinces, for example, the Middle Creeks, who are also the Tallapoosa's, the Upper Creeks, sometimes called the Abekas. There's also Lower Creeks over here. The Alabamas, they comprise the 4th province, but they're not depicted on this map. Other than the old Alabama or French fort there at the conjunction of the Alabama, Coosa, and Tallapoosa rivers. But these are the 4 core provinces of Creek country. For our purposes today, I'm really just going to be talking about most of the Creek towns that inhabited the Tallapoosa and Coosa rivers up here. Those were the ones who were most affected by the Creek War and which would experience significant devastation at the hands of the American military. By the early 19th century or the early 1800s, one of the most important leaders in the Creek world and in the National Council was Big Warrior, or Tustanuggy Flucko, literally meaning big warrior. Flucko is someone who's big or powerful, not really in physical stature, but more or less in kind of political and diplomatic influence. This name is also a war title. Big warrior, like all male warriors in Creek society, took titles as a result of their prowess in war, in hunting, and their diplomatic endeavors. And you would kind of climb the military ranking system, earning more and more titles, the more successful you were at taking life, both animal and human life. Big Warrior doesn't really have any images or any way to kind of depict what he looked like. Like many other Native American leaders, we just kind of don't have any extant evidence of their likeness. But he probably dressed like other headmen in that he would have worn like a turban on his head, some sashes around his chest, as well as some jewelry, such as gorgets and medals. These were objects that kind of connoted a headman's connection to, say, like the federal government or maybe the British Empire, depending on the time period. They didn't dress like in a traditional kind of waistcoat and breeches like Europeans or white Americans. So they look rather different in terms of their dress and material culture from white Americans. The only kind of image that I could find in the records of Big Warrior is just simply his initials. Tustanuggy Flucko here, that was actually composed by a scribe from the American government. That's not his own handwriting, but I think this is the BW. You can see the kind of shaky script. That's the only real image I could ever find of Big Warrior, and yet he's such an important figure in Creek and Southern history. He was a complicated person. He captured both the changes and continuities that had come to Creek society by the early 19th century. He was part of a new generation of leadership in that headmen started to have stronger authority. The National Council became more powerful. The council, for example, in the early 19th century, issued a number of execution orders to kill warriors who had attacked American settlers. And in fact, that was one cause of the Creek War. Many Creeks, like the Red Sticks, objected to this newfound authority embodied by the National Council. Big Warrior was also a wealthy property owner. I don't know if he had slaves. I haven't really seen the evidence for that. He could have, but many other Creek headmen in the National Council did in fact own enslaved people of African descent. And many leaders like him began to really think about the vision, the future for Creek country in terms of the United States. They came to the realization that if they were going to maybe protect their lands, then maybe the one way to do that is to forge a peaceful alliance with the United States government and make a transition to a more kind of capitalist, commercially driven economy. So Big Warrior represented these major changes in Creek society. But I argue he was also a Creek patriot to the bone. Like his Red Stick opponents, he did want to protect the Creeks from harm, from American influence, from American expansion. I'll read you a couple of quotes that I think are illustrative of his mindset here in the early 19th century. Big Warrior told one of his Cherokee correspondents by the name of Pathkiller, he said, "The 4 rivers," meaning the 4 provinces of Creek country, "are for us to live upon, and therefore to defend from American incursion." Just this language of 4 rivers really kind of points up a Creek-centered understanding of this world. At another point, Big Warrior expressed his fear to an American official that we may lose our land from the Chattahoochee River on the east to the Coosa waters on the west. So again, he was kind of invoking this riverine world that he desperately wanted to defend from the United States. And like the Red Sticks, like his opponents, he sought to build a coalition involving multiple native populations. I'll read you another quote. As Big Warrior told another Cherokee correspondent, he said that we must defend our lands for our families and for our children, and try to unite ourselves in peace and happiness. His thinking was that the Creeks could team up with the nearby Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees to create a pan-Indian or intertribal union. That's very similar to his Red Stick opponents who kind of looked to the north and formed an alliance with the Shawnees in the Ohio River Valley. But there was one key difference between Big Warrior and the Red Sticks, and that was that he pursued an alliance with the United States, especially the agent appointed for the Southeastern Indians. And that agent was named Benjamin Hawkins, or Agent Hawkins. To Big Warrior, pursuing this kind of alliance might actually lead to a useful coexistence between Creeks and Americans, and that would be a way to maybe guarantee the sovereignty and independence of the Creek people. But women as well as men played important roles in this story too. At the outset of the Creek War, during the Creek War, and even after, women were present. They continued to shape political and diplomatic affairs in the American South. Although most women probably affiliated with the Red Stick movement or those Creeks in active rebellion against the United States, some women did fear that this civil war would provoke white Southerners and the US military more broadly to invade Creek country. In their minds, this rebellion was suicidal. Well, why wouldn't white Southerners who are anxious to acquire the fertile lands of Creek country use this rebellion as a pretext to invade? And this is what ends up happening. And we know this, of course. But I want to focus on women's thoughts here. But this is essentially their outlook. And they took active measures to protect, especially their loved ones, their kin, from the Red Sticks and eventually from the American military. The Red Sticks really targeted people who didn't seem to mind the newfound power of the National Council, or who, of course, actively supported the council, and those like Big Warrior. They wanted to execute these people. They considered them traitors to Creek country. But the Red Sticks also wanted to kill like white American traders who lived in Creek country and who had intermarried with Creek women. So, for example, there was one woman, I don't know her name, but she was a trader's wife. She was the wife of Hardy Reid. He had lived among the Creeks for many years. He supplied trade goods to the Creeks. And he was in danger. The Red Sticks wanted to kill him. I don't know specifically how this particular woman sought to protect her husband, but she did in fact alert him to Red Stick movements. She kind of let him know where they might show up and when they might kill him. I don't believe he was killed. I never saw that in the records, but this woman, this Creek woman, wanted to protect her white American husband from harm. In another example, in the town of Hoithley-Wally, which is actually spelled right here, in the town of Hoithley-Wally, we know that Red Sticks had recently killed some white American settlers, and they returned to their town here where they had lived, and they wanted to make their escape. But according to one primary source I found, the women of that town hid the canoes. They hid one of the only means of transportation for a quick getaway. And those Red Stick men were later caught too, as a result of the active intervention here of women. In other cases, Creek women served as spies during the Creek War, gathering intelligence about Red Stick military movements, their tactics, their weapons. And these women reported to Agent Benjamin Hawkins and Big Warrior. This is most apparent here in the source I have up on the screen. A red woman or a Creek woman of Hoithley-Wally actually gathered some intelligence that she learned about the Red Sticks, and she passed that information on to Big Warrior and the council and Agent Hawkins. So in sum here, yes, the Creek War involved men doing the majority of the fighting, but women did have an important place here in this story. They were trying to kind of actively thwart the Red Sticks every step of the way. But the turning point came in the middle of 1813, with two crucial military engagements, one being the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek in the southern part of the United States. So this was in July specifically. The Red Sticks managed to kill about 100 white militiamen and Creeks of mixed descent, or the Métis Creeks. They had both white and Creek parentage. Later on in August, the Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims, and this would come to be known as Fort Mims Massacre. The Red Sticks killed about 250 people. And as a result, the Creeks in the United States inched closer to open war, just what Creek women had feared. However, the Creeks did take one more shot at diplomacy. In the fall of 1813, shortly before U.S. invasion, headmen from about a dozen different Creek towns gathered together and messaged Agent Hawkins and other American officials, pleading with them to recognize that there at least were some Creeks who did not want this war with the United States, and that there were some Creeks who did in fact renounce the Red Stick movement. I'll read one final quote here from a headman named Mad Warrior. He was from the town of Fish Ponds. And as he explained in his message to Hawkins, he says, his townspeople are determined not to kill red or white people, meaning other Native people or white Americans. And there are other talks like this, other messages like this, that the Creeks sent to American officials. Yet U.S. invasion came nonetheless. It started in November of 1813 and lasted all the way into the spring of 1814. Of course, the culminating battle was at Tohopeka, or Horseshoe Bend, in the upper Tallapoosa River. Hundreds of Red Sticks were killed by Andrew Jackson and the American Army. During the course of this U.S. invasion, dozens of towns were destroyed. There's a really good archaeological study done by Gregory Wazelkoff, who has kind of looked at a lot of the records, archaeological excavations of Old Creek country, and he and his team found several years ago that maybe close to 50 different communities were in fact just razed, demolished by the American military. Not to mention hundreds of individual homes where Creek families lived. Those were destroyed too. And finally, hundreds of Creeks, not all of them Red Sticks, perished as a result of this war. So the Red Sticks were defeated by the spring of 1814, and a victorious Andrew Jackson imposed a treaty of conquest. It's known as the Treaty of Fort Jackson. This was in August of 1814. Basically, it blamed all Creeks, not even just the Red Sticks, for this rebellion against the United States. And it wrested lots of land from the Creeks and transferred authority to the federal government. A little more than 21 million acres of land, in fact, carving out a lot of what is today Alabama, and a portion of Georgia and northern Florida. Big Warrior was actually one of the treaty delegates at this particular conference. There was really nothing he could do. This was forced on him and other allies in the National Council. But this was certainly an astounding victory for the U.S., and it came at the expense of Creek country. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, Big Warrior shows up in the records again. And he's protesting, he's complaining about how much land the Creeks ceded to the United States. Apparently, the Creeks didn't really know how much they had agreed to give up in this treaty, although they didn't really agree because it was forced on them anyway. It was sort of coerced. Agent Hawkins may not have known either how big this treaty was going to be, but it turned out to be little more than 21 million acres of land. Big Warrior couldn't believe it. Even in the aftermath, however, Big Warrior still tried to develop some kind of workable relationship with the United States, but really to no avail. I mean, it would be many years before the Creeks would be removed from their lands. And as I mentioned at the outset, there would be another war in 1836, another Creek rebellion against the United States. So the Creeks continued to fight. Many of the Red Sticks who did survive this particular war just migrated down to Seminole country, essentially, in Florida. And kind of kept up their anti-American attitudes there. And there's a whole different history about the United States' relationship with the Seminoles. Various wars took place throughout the early 19th century. So the Red Stick movement continued on in some cases, but so too did this importance of Creek diplomacy. The Creeks had, and I think have always been, good diplomats, good stewards of their towns and their families. They continue to have a relationship with the federal government. Most of them are, of course, in Oklahoma today, but there are some in Alabama as well. But both of these Creek nations have federal recognition and continue to invest in diplomacy with the United States. All right, so that concludes my talk. Thank you.
So we'll take a few minutes for questions.
Sure. Yeah.
On the left map there. Let's try and sort of the previous slide.
Yep.
The diplomacy, right? So from Horseshoe Bend to basically about short of it, is that the sort of main area where all this activity? So I'm really interested in what Lake Martin replaced, and I've been sort of down at last year now. So I'm just interested as I'm looking at the map. I was wondering if you give me some insight on what happened to the left of that line, shorter and Horseshoe Bend.
You mean like right around? Like,
Yeah, so Lake
Tohopeka
Martin
River?
is right to the left, somewhere in the middle, or
Or-
exists.
Kind of in here, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics in terms of actual kind of locations,
Okay.
who was involved in these battles, but the core area of the Creek War, where the American military fought against the Red Sticks, it's kind of in this old Upper Creek country here, in the Tallapoosa, Coosa River. I think there are some battles up here in the northern part of the Coosa River, yeah, such as Talladega. But yeah, I couldn't give you specific examples of that, but yeah, this is kind of the core of the military theater in the Creek War.
And it's right
Definitely wrong.
Yeah, the largest town studied by Lake Martin was the town of Busky. And if you go on, here's Harold, if you go on the, if you go on the, plains, Cherokee-American, there is an overlook. You can actually look over and see where the town of Busky was underneath the waters of Lake Martin.
Hmm. Sockfusky's underwater then? That's sad. That's too bad. Because, yeah.
They give up there too, but I just, you follow.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I'm a Stroud, and there's two incidents of Stroud, and 1818, that was the Ogley Stroud massacre on Old Federal Road.
Okay.
And in Stroud, Alabama, there were no Strouds, I understand he lived there, but they thought, do you have any accusations of that? But the Red Sticks did kill at that Ogley Stroud.
I don't know.
Burial on that road.
Yeah, I don't know the family, the name.
And it makes sense of what you're talking about, the context.
Yeah. Okay. About where would that be on this map?
It's heading down toward, I guess, Clark County. It's a road called Highway 23. We're gonna
Okay.
see where Fort Jackson is. All that.
This is revealing my ignorance of
Yes.
Alabama geography.
Southwest of Montgomery, but.
Okay.
You pointed to that area.
Yeah.
Fort Jackson is
Yeah.
like Wetumpka, which is right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this should be north of Montgomery, right? So maybe it's.
South of Montgomery,
Yeah.
southwest. Anyway, that's kind of hard to think on that.
I know, yeah.
Anyway, thank you. It's kind of.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But the Red Sticks were heavily involved in that, which led
Hmm.
toward what I read. Is
Okay.
treaty
Okay.
of Fort Jackson.
Gotcha.
Or
Okay.
something else happened.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'm sorry I can't enlighten you there on the Strouds.
You mentioned the 4 divisions of the
Yeah.
Creek Nation, and you mentioned the Tallapoosa, but you didn't mention the other 3. I assume they were Muskogee and Uchi, but I don't know, what were the other 3?
Yeah, let me, sorry. Oop, 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 oop. Oh, this thing is temperamental. Yeah, I didn't mention all 4 just because I didn't want to maybe get into all the details. So there are 3 on this map here: Lower Creeks, Middle Creeks, and Upper Creeks. Lower Creeks kind of clustered around the Chattahoochee River. They're also known as the Cowitas in the historical records because of the important town of Coweta. There's also the town of Cusita. The Middle Creeks are sometimes known as the Tallapoosas, who inhabited most of the area along the Tallapoosa River. The Upper Creeks, this is the 3rd province. They're known as the Abikas or the Cusas in the records sometimes. And they lived along the Coosa River here for the most part, but you could find Abika towns sometimes along the the Tallapoosa River here in between the 2 rivers. And then finally, the Alabamas, they're the 4th province, and they lived along kind of the upper portion of the Alabama River. But together, those 4 people constituted the Creek country, the Creek Nation. And yeah, they were Muskogee speakers. Yeah, they spoke dialects of the larger Muskogean language family. But the Tallapoosas, the Abikas, and the Alabamas were the kind of core constituents of the Red Stick movement. Those are the people against whom Big Warrior was fighting, at least in a diplomatic sense. Yeah. Sure.
So this is more of a question for Nick. There were several Creek companies that fought on the side of the U.S. Were those companies town-based, were they clan-based, or were simply political divisions?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of research on this. To some degree, you could say that town affiliation is what shaped Creek's decisions to fight, on the side of the United States. But for the most part, I think it really is just sort of an ideological or a political kind of rift. There are those who support the National Council, support doing something with the United States, and then there are those who don't. There are those who just want to rid Creek country of all American influence, get rid of those traitorous people like Big Warrior, and fight against the United States. I think it's more of a political and ideological division there that motivated participation in the war. But historians do argue this endlessly. But I think that makes maybe the most sense. So, yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
Did the Creeks almost exclusively live along the rivers that were nearby them? Were they primarily agriculture? Did they have any were any of the towns foraging based?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the vast majority of Creek towns lived along a major river like the Chattahoochee or the Tallapoosa, but some of them lived along smaller streams or creeks. And really all southeastern, Indian people did this because you need to have your crops near a source of fresh water. They did forage to some degree, and that was really the purview of Creek women and their children. They certainly would go out into the forest or prairie and gather wild roots, berries, and just other edible plants. But farming was the kind of core economic way of living for the Creeks. By the early 19th century, though, I should say, many Creeks kept livestock. And that fell into the leadership of women. They tended herds of cattle. They brought them to markets in places like Mobile. So they had made that kind of shift to a more commercial kind of agriculture, but they still continue to farm too. So there's a mixture there, a mixed economy, if you will, with the Creeks. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, lots of questions.
I had a question about sort of
Mm.
sort of politics and diplomacy, is when you're making big decisions about war and dealing with the foreign, basically foreign country.
Yeah.
People tend to be very.
Yeah, so the Creeks, I think, were, in the eyes of Europeans and Americans, notoriously divisive. They could not agree really on anything. They're always arguing about the proper way forward. And when I mention consensus here, I'm talking about very lengthy discussions involving a lot of individual headmen, maybe from one town, maybe from multiple towns, even from multiple provinces in Creek country. And these could go on for days, figuring out whether you want to go to war with, or make peace with an enemy or a potential enemy, whether you want to trade with the British Empire versus the French Empire. I mean, yeah, there'd be, lots of argument. Sometimes a consensus couldn't be reached and Creeks just went their own way. There's kind of a streak of individualism that you see in the records. So for example, if one headman doesn't want to go along with the consensus to trade with the British, maybe he goes down to like Pensacola and trades with the Spanish in the early 18th century. I mean, that was common. So Creeks often, take those different courses of action, but the ideal is always to try to arrive at some sort of agreement that everyone can be a party to. Yeah, hope that. Okay, one more question. Sure.
After the Civil War, was there any attempts to reconcile or reconciliation between the Red Sticks and also the other groups? Or did that continue on? I mean, was it still that animosity even after the Civil War?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think I know enough there. I mean, perhaps some Creeks participated with the U.S. Army in attacking the Seminoles. Maybe I've seen some references to that in the secondary literature, but I don't know from the perspective of like primary sources. Yeah, I don't know. I think those tensions certainly lasted for a long time. People like Big Warrior in particular were hated. I mean, they're persona non grata, right? Yeah, that's all I can say to that. Yeah. All right. All right. Well, thank you for your questions. Thanks, everyone.
That was really cool. All right, so we have a couple minutes before our next speaker, who will begin at 5 till the hour. So if you want to take about a 7-minute break, grab some coffee and pastry, hit the restroom. We'll see you back here. Please be in your seats before 5 till. Hello, folks. It's about that time. I know we're all excited to hear Dr. Abram speak. So if y'all could go ahead and take your seats, that would be very cool. I'll be quick, I promise. Okay, folks, if y'all are ready. Okay. All right. So I am very excited to announce our next speaker. I've been reading her stuff for many years, and I really can't wait to hear her speak. It's Dr. Sue Abram, who is an associate instructor of history at Western Carolina University and the author of Cherokees in the Creek War in Tohopeka, Rethinking the Creek War and the War of 1812. She authored Forging a Cherokee-American Alliance in the Creek War from Creation to Betrayal, which won the 2013 Ann B. and James B. McMillan Prize in Southern History by the University of Alabama Press. Her presentation today will explore perspectives on forging the Cherokee-American Alliance in the Red Stick War. Please welcome Dr. Sue Abrams.
Thank you, Stacy. Well, let me tell you something. This being here today means a whole lot to me. I was invited to speak here last year, and just a few days before, I had to call them and beg off because I was sick. My husband and I had gone for our 50th wedding anniversary to the happiest place on earth in Florida, and we brought back COVID. So needless to say, I've been holding my breath for the last few weeks because guess where we went like last week? Back to Disney. So anyway, it's always a pleasure to come here. This has been my home away from home for 5 years, back when I was learning from Dr. Braun there and other professors here at Auburn University. And it's just been a pleasure to be back right here on Pebble Hill ground, because when I was a graduate assistant, I was working over here at the Online Encyclopedia of Alabama with some of those folks right there. And so it was just a wonderful experience. And at that time, this building wasn't there. The guest house, the Lowry guest house wasn't there. So it looks a whole lot different. And so it's just a real pleasure to be back here on the loveliest village in the on the plains. I want to thank Mark Wilson again and Mabon, where there she is back there, for hosting us here at the Carolyn Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities. They do wonderful work here. And also thank you to the kind folks at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park, Stacy, Travis, and Ryan. All of you mean a whole lot to me, because you keep the symposium going every year and have some great speakers to keep the word out about what happened there at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park. And Matthew Robinson could not be here today, but I especially appreciate his efforts in putting this together and getting all of the speakers together. It was not as smooth as it might have looked at this moment. So let me go ahead and get started here. I'm going to be talking about some perspectives on how this alliance came to be and why it came to be. Because the Cherokees were in a situation where they could have taken a lot of different roads. They could have either joined the Red Sticks, or they could have declared themselves neutral throughout the entire war, or they could have done what they did, and that was decide to join the American forces against the Red Stick War. So in the late 1813, the Cherokees had agreed that they would finally join American forces against the Red Sticks. And this was not an easy decision for them to come about. So I'll kind of go through how that came to be. They share borders, as we saw with the maps that Dr. Peach had up. They share borders with the United States and the Creek Nation. And this kind of made it inevitable that some kind of conflict would commence as the Creek Civil War just burst onto the scene. And this was like a smaller conflict within the larger conflict of the War of 1812 that was brewing. So this presentation then will take us through this forging of a Cherokee-American alliance and how these two groups, who were once bitter enemies, become united in a common cause. First of all, let's look at an overall picture. The long, drawn out, almost 2 decades long war that had occurred before this time was the Chickamauga War. And some of the Cherokees had decided during the American Revolution to side with the British against the Americans. And so they had not only Shawnee allies during this time, but they also had Creek allies. And they ended up being called the Chickamaugas. And so this, it ended, the whole war ended in the 1790s when one of their primary war chiefs, Dragging Canoe, died. And it wasn't long after that, then the whole thing fell apart. But 20 years of war, that takes its toll. That takes its toll on a people. And we have to realize that during the early Republic period, once the United States was formed, there were over 7 armed conflicts that occurred in Indian country east of the Mississippi River. And all of these ended with the U.S. gaining land each time after the signing of peace treaties. So how did this 20-year war affect the Cherokees? Now, this isn't actually Dragging Canoe, it's just an artist's rendition. In the aftermath, we see huge destruction within the Cherokee territories. There was vast disruptions to their towns, destructions of towns. I think over 40 towns were destroyed completely. It disrupted their family and tribal lives. And of course, it ended with loss of land. So once the Cherokees had to abandon these 40 towns, they started readjusting their population. Instead of being focused all around one town center and then having their agricultural fields surrounding it, they started having individual farmsteads and homesteads up and down the waterway. So they were more spread out. And they still had their town centers where they would go for councils or to dance or do other ceremonies. But it was completely different. They were much more dispersed. And so all of this meant that because of the war and the disruption to their own lives, the loss of their land and towns, their agriculture was not doing very well. A lot of their traditions that they had carried on for years was not doing very well because war had been the center of everything for so long. And then on top of this, we get some really bad droughts happening in this area. Bad droughts, especially in 1804, 1807, and again in 1811, leading up to the Creek War, and also the War of 1812. And some of these areas of repopulation suffered really bad because of the poor corn harvest. And they had to turn to the United States. And the Indian agent at that time was Return Jonathan Meigs. And he held this position like for 23 years. So he knew the Cherokee well. He traded food for land. He took payments from their federal annual treaty monies that they were supposed to get. So it wasn't that they gave the Cherokee anything. It's they traded in order to keep these people from starving. For example, during those starving years, he provided 80 Cherokee families from 7 upper towns with 268 bushels of corn. This is just one instance, as well as providing similar sustenance to 38 more families in the lower Cherokee towns. So all of this was done while they were trying to rebuild their lives, get back going, get their farmsteads up and running after 20 years of devastating warfare and destruction. And their main purpose at this point in time was to live side by side by their Creek neighbors and side by side with their American neighbors peacefully. Second, it should be noted that the Cherokees do attempt to live peacefully, but this was not an easy task. During this time, Meigs had sanctioned at the Cherokees' request for at least 341 white settlers or white people to come into the Cherokee Nation. He utilized a type of a passport program. And so these people were there legally. And what they were brought in to do was to provide services to the Cherokees, like provide millers for the corn grist mill, blacksmiths, ferrymen, and even teachers. And so these people were sanctioned to come on Cherokee land to provide these services. Now, some Cherokees took it on their own to lease to individual white settlers. And then they became like sharecroppers. And we know how that works. You know, you give them a piece of land and in return, they give you some of their harvest. But the only problem with the whole thing was when those people's contracts were up, they didn't leave. They didn't renew necessarily. And so they hoped that if they could just pressure the federal government enough, that they could encourage the Cherokees to cede that land that they were on. And a lot of times they would kind of congregate in areas. Now, why would they think that they could do that? Well, between 1801 and 1841, Congress signed 18 special preemptive acts that allowed squatters now to be legitimate and to stay on their lands legally. So per treaty stipulations, however, the federal government was obliged to remove any illegal squatters. They called them intruders. So earlier, President Jefferson had decommissioned most of the backcountry forts and garrisons to save costs after the American Revolution. So Meigs did have a small garrison nearby that he could count on, and he would send them out, and sometimes he would go with them, as this letter shows, and remove these illegal squatters, force them out to leave their farmsteads, their crops that they were growing in their fields. And they were attempting to do the right thing per the treaties that were signed with the Cherokees. Yet what happened? As fast as they ran them off, they came back. So the Cherokees, to help the American soldiers, and with Meigs' encouragement, they even formed their own light horse regulators to help patrol their lands. But again, the same thing was happening because they didn't want any bloodshed. They didn't want to cause any instance that might bring the government down on them with soldiers against the Cherokee people. They would remove a white intruder, they would return. So it was this ongoing cycle of unrest within Cherokee country. Another problem, and this was on the Cherokee side of it all, was that they often joined what they termed pony clubs. And this is really just kind of a tame label to put to horse rustlers and cattle rustlers. You know, they were outlaws. And so the young men really liked doing this. They found it exciting and very lucrative to just go in with lightning fast speed, hit a kind of isolated settlement or an isolated farmstead of white people, grab their horses and actually run with those horses. And this wasn't the only pony club operating in the Southeast. There were white pony clubs too. And so, you know, you could trade with other pony clubs and you might get horses from another region and they would get your horses that you'd stolen from your region, and then they couldn't trace them and identify them, and they would be sold then maybe down in South Carolina or elsewhere. So it was an easy way to make a lot of money. It was exciting. And it was a way for these young Cherokee men to access feeling like real men. And I put that in quotes. This was like the transitioning from a young adult into a full manhood. So it was a masculine expression. So you could either do one of two things if you were a young Cherokee man. You could either join the light horse regulators, which was legally sanctioned, or you could join a pony club, which was illegal and made you an outlaw. Now, one example of this is the Ridge, and I'll talk about him several times throughout this talk. He had become a young warrior or a real man and earned his manhood by going to war in the Chickamauga era. And so, I mean, he was really young then, and he had a hard, rough way to go in order to prove his masculinity as far as Cherokee terms go. Now he's a rising star in Cherokee politics. He supports peaceful relations with the U.S. government, and he becomes a light horse regulator. And in this capacity, he was carrying out not only removing intruders, but early on, he was part of an assassination against a tribal headman by the name of Doublehead, who had illegally gone against the tribal council, They had made a decree not to cede any more Cherokee land. And he had made a treaty with the government and had ceded land. And even there was a secret clause in it where he benefited greatly from it secretly. So he actually was assassinated. So though the Ridge, you might ask, say, well, why was the Ridge doing all this? Well, first of all, he wanted that good relationship with the United States, but also he had seen what the U.S. military had done in their military expeditions against the Chickamauga towns that were so devastating. So he always wanted to stay on their good side. At the same time, he became really a staunch advocate of Cherokee sovereignty and believed in a centralizing government to protect Cherokee land. So tensions grew as it looked at like the war was going to break out with Great Britain. And Meigs was writing, "The United States and the Cherokees must hold each other by the hand and all will be well," he said. So he spoke at the Cherokee Council in November of 1811, and he reminded them that the British during the last war, you know, the American Revolution, when the Cherokees had sided with the British, that they left you in distress after you had generously shed your own blood in their defense. And so, you know, he was pretty much saying, if it comes to taking sides, you better not take their side again, because you know what happened the last time they up and left you, just left you. So Meigs wrote to Secretary of War, and at that time it was William Eustis, that some Cherokee had recently attended a Creek Council at Tohopeka, where a delegation of Shawnees had come from the north seeking allies for the coming war. And they had chosen the British to ally with. And they issued a stark warning to the Cherokees. "Brothers, there are two paths. One is light and clear. The other is covered with clouds. If you take the light path, you may be safe. But if you take the dark path, you may lose your lands." So they were pretty much saying, you know, be careful what you choose. So again, the Cherokees are sitting on the fence. Which way do you go? So Eustis answers Meigs' concerns by saying, if our country should be hard pressed by the English, it may be expedient to accept the service of some of these people. For like all other Indians, they are as unstable as water. And from a love of war, they might join our enemies rather than be only idle spectators. So again, they didn't know. The Cherokees still had a decision to make if it came to it, and we know it was heading that way. So at this point, the Cherokees are sitting on the fence. They're not going one way or the other. They prefer, if they could, to stay neutral. So that year 1811, it becomes very important in this story for lots of reasons. This is the year that up north in the Ohio River Valley with the Shawnees, we see the rise of a prophetic movement led by Tecumseh. And here you see a rendering of Tecumseh. And Tecumseh had a brother, his name was Tenskwatawa, and he was more along the religious lines, while Tecumseh was along the militaristic lines. And so they did dances up there in the Ohio River Valley, and they called it the Dance of the Lakes because they were up near the Great Lakes, or the Ghost Dance. And the whole idea was to bring back the old ways. And what they wanted their followers to do was get rid of everything that had to do with white culture, white consumer goods, and return to their old ways. And they thought that they would be rewarded with this. In fact, Tenskwatawa prophesied the imminent cataclysmic destruction of whites. And when that happened, there was supposed to be a restoration of game. All the game from the devastation of the deer skin trade would come back. Tecumseh sought to form a pan-Indian confederacy whose sole purpose was to push white settlers back east across the Appalachian Mountains. Now, Cherokee oral history recalls that Tecumseh came to the Great Smoky Mountains at Sokol Gap and that the Cherokees turned him down. Now, we don't have any documents that say that, but that's the oral traditions that was passed down for 100 years or more. So at the same time, the Cherokees were experiencing this popping up of prophets in their lands. Many had been converted while attending talks at Kusawati, where they experienced visions at a great medicine dance. They entreated the Cherokees to stop growing or plowing the land because they said those iron plows were ripping up, Mother Earth. And then that was just, the Great Spirit was not going to like this. They preached again for the return of the old ways. Old Charlie or Solly and Laughing Molly are two of these prophets that we know about from the records. And like Laughing Molly, she prophesied that a great storm with hailstones that were the size of Canona block would destroy non-believers. And a Canona is a Cherokee corn pounder. It's made out of the log that stands up like this, and it's hollowed out, and you take the pestle and beat the corn until you get the meal. And so you can imagine hail that big coming at you. And people were afraid. They were really afraid. And so they told the believers, go hide up in the mountains. You'll be safe up there. And some of these self-proclaimed prophets decided they were going to attend council to pursue their agenda, which was to join against the United States. The Ridge, again, he's a regulator, a light horse regulator, and now he is a national committee member. He challenges them. And before I go further, the Cherokee government by this time, they didn't have their constitution at this time, but they did have a Cherokee National Council made up of the older wise men of the tribe. And then they had the Cherokee National Committee that was 13 younger people who kind of took care of the everyday business of the tribe. And so they were challenging. They were challenging the committee. Let's go to war. And Ridge stands up against them. And he says, no, you all you're false. You're not with it. You're not telling the truth. And we can't get caught up in our emotions and go with what you're saying. He made one of those believers so angry that he drew a knife and he came at the Ridge to stab him. And he would have succeeded in probably killing him if one of the Ridge's friends hadn't stepped in and taken the blow instead. That's how emotional it got that day. In the next few months, what we see is refugees. They're seeking to get away from those hailstones that are coming. They are marching by, going to the higher elevations. Some of them are staying behind and they're feverishly doing ceremonies like going to water, purifying themselves, and doing dances to pray and keep the earth from falling apart. Because at this same time, what was happening was the New Madrid earthquakes and numerous aftershocks. And we all know the histories of those. It devastated a lot of areas. But the Cherokees, who were these prophets, they were saying, hey, the earth's very old and she's mad. She doesn't like being ripped up with these plows. And it could just break apart on us if we're not careful. So what happened? Nothing. The hailstorm didn't come. No one died. And the prophets were proven false. And so this challenge to the Cherokee governmental authority had been defeated without any bloodshed. And this whole prophetic movement had been put down just by letting it write itself out. Now, the picture that you see there on your left is the Ridge. He later will be elevated to a major, from a lieutenant to a major in the Creek War. This is a much later picture, so he was a lot younger then. They did a portrait of him. The guy on the right is one of the prominent Lowry brothers. There was George and John Lowry, who had a horse farm. They had a horse corrals up near the old town of Running Water, which was an old Chickamauga town. So as the bloody civil war among the Creeks, their neighbors, was breaking out, this Cherokee prophecy movement died, and Cherokee leadership still sought to be neutral until in 1812, 3 committee members, and that included John Walker, the Ridge, and one of the Lowry brothers, it might have been George, we don't know, made a case that they wished to raise a number of young men and offer their services to the United States. Instead of greenlighting the suggestion, the council decided to remain neutral and relayed this to a lower town Creek Council. And as we know, Dr. Peach had the map up there that showed you where the lower creeks were. And so it was oftentimes that Cherokees would attend Creek councils and vice versa. Yet, they voiced that if they join U.S. efforts in the upcoming war with the British, that the Cherokees would secure the friendship of the United States forever. And that's an important statement. Meigs continued entreating to his superiors that if war broke out, they might, meaning the Cherokees, they might render a valuable service, though he personally would detest the idea of employing Indians. Eustis answered that the Cherokees were impressionable. They were like blank stationery on which may be written anything. So the government was going back and forth. Do we really want to employ Indians? Can we really count on the Cherokees if we put them into our service? Are they going to stay loyal to us? And Meigs thought, okay, yeah, we need to do this because it will serve as a pledge of their fidelity to the United States for all that they had done for them during the civilization program. Now, by 1812, of course, I want to make this point clear. Did the Cherokees know this back and forth was going on and that these condescending remarks were being made? Absolutely not. They were never led in that direction with any honest discussion. So by mid-1812, besides the issues dealing with outlaws and the white intruders, the activities of their Creek neighbors became alarming. Indeed, there was reports of Creek parties murdering white settlers on the frontier, and this led to the government reinforcing some of the old posts around the Cherokee Nation, the garrisons. So fear of Creek deprivations coming in and bleeding into Cherokee country became a real thing. There are some incidents that are recorded of that happening. For instance, Avery Van's cabin was totally burnt to the ground by a Red Stick raiding party, and an Etowah woman was captured and killed during one of their raids. Again, it was very quick in and out. It wasn't like a full-fledged battle or anything. These were just raids on isolated individuals or homesteads. But it made everybody fearful. By early fall, when the Creek War had exploded, the Civil War in their country, Many Cherokees again were offering to join against the British by early 1813. And still Meigs was hesitating because he was afraid that if Cherokee warriors left their homesteads, that the Red Sticks then would see this as, oh, this homestead is undefended and we'll take it down. But there was also white settlers who were fearing what the Cherokees might do, because to them it was one Indian is the same as another Indian. And so unless they knew them as true neighbors right next door, their fear and rage just deepened as the Civil War amongst the Creeks kept going. So Cherokee headmen Tuchula and Chulio had Meigs publish a letter in one of the prominent newspapers that came out of Tennessee, and he issued the letter was to state that we want to keep peace with our white neighbors. They were hoping to de-escalate that tension. On the other hand, at the same time, the Cherokees sent down a message to the Creeks not to join the Red Sticks in their rebellion, noting, "Take care, we do not frighten your children," meaning that if they would not sit idle if these incursions into Cherokee country continued against their people. So at this time, many many Creek families were fleeing their towns. And this included like some of the lower towns of Coweta and Casita to seek refuge among their Cherokee neighbors in this Creek Civil War. Big Warrior, who you learned about, and his supporters warned the Cherokees to arm themselves against the Red Stick insurgents. Some 200 Creeks fled to Browns Valley, which this was near present-day Red Hill, Alabama, and Turkeytown, where the principal chief Pathkiller resided. Nachi headman Chinnaby himself brought about 35 families to Turkeytown. And we will see once the Cherokee Regiment is formed, there is a group of Nachis that form a company within the Cherokee Regiment. So in this map here, there is Willstown. This is Cherokee territory all through here. And this is Turkeytown. There's Fort Armstrong. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. The other things that we will be talking about, all this area is Creek territory. And you get Tohopeka and Tohopeka, and Horseshoe Bend is down here. There's your Oak Fusty that's underwater today, right there on that map. And so that kind of gives you a little feel for what's.
Could you put that in perspective in today's geography? Is Turkeytown like Fort Payne or something?
It's the Turkeytown. It's on 411. It's east of Gas.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm rusty on that. Yeah. And there's Fort Struthers. So, you know, I mean, and Fort Deposit up here. So you can see how close the Cherokees are. They're kind of pinned in between Americans to the north. And if you go further over here, you've got the Georgians, and then over here, the Mississippi Territory settlers too. And they all raise their own military expeditions to hit Creek country. Okay, so when the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek happens in 1813, this is really kind of marks the beginning of the American intervention in the Creek War. And at the same time, the Ridge, who has helped William McIntosh go back to his home, comes back with a message for the Cherokees to help the Creeks. And these are the national Creeks. So they do so. Now that regiment that is formed is 7 companies of Cherokees Not all of the companies even have 100 men in them. Okay, so why did they do this is the bottom line. So in September of 1813, the Cherokee National Council sanctioned going to war against the Red Sticks as American allies, alongside some national Creeks. By doing so, they sought to guarantee their future as a sovereign and separate people. They became Cherokee warriors fighting alongside American soldiers. They were equal in rank and pay. Now, this is one thing Jackson did insist on. So if you were a private in the militia, you got $8 a month. If you were a private in the Cherokee regiment, you got $8 a month promised to you. First and foremost, the Cherokees believed it a sacred duty to protect their families and their homesteads. And second, they believed that forging this alliance would create a sacred compact between them and the United States that proved themselves that they were worthy to be neighbors and allies, equal allies. Third, participation in sanctioned warfare actions provided young Cherokee men an avenue to become real men through the warrior tradition. And thus the Cherokees saw joining themselves as, and this you will see through the literature, they are a band of brothers. The Cherokees speak about this, the US government speaks about this. And so there's warriors fighting side by side with American soldiers in a common cause. Thank you.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
On Cherokee population dispersal, during the 1990 census as a political science that's here, I was appointed on a local advisory committee. And when we got the final 1990 census paper maps back, about 1991, there were these green lines that were drawn through Auburn. And I asked, well, what are these? And they said, well, those are tribal boundaries. And I said, oh, really? Because this was when the Porch Bandit Creeks were trying to get a casino down in Montgomery, which the state opposed, and they finally moved it across the county lines, you know, the Wind Creek there in Wetumpka, okay? So anyway, I asked, well, who applied for this through Auburn? And I was told the Cherokee. And do you know of any Cherokee dispersed Cherokee that were in the Auburn area?
No.
Okay, well, I didn't either,
And
but
when
this,
you say the Cherokee, I don't know. There's only 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes.
yeah,
The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians near Smoky Mountains, where we're from. And then there's the United Kadua Band in Oklahoma and Cherokee Nation, which was the main crux of what was removed during the removal in 1838. So there are state recognized groups, so it might have been one of them.
okay, well, what happened was some of you may know John Cottier, who was a professor here. His father was a professor here. He grew up here. Dr. Cottier came back to Auburn, was professor of archaeology for 25 years at the time of this 91 period. And he told me flatly that he had never encountered any archaeological evidence of the Cherokee. So I had previously worked for a year up in the Interior Department on a faculty fellowship program. They wanted me to stay. I declined, came back here a couple of years later when someone retired. They wanted me back to the GS-14, and I still preferred to stay in Auburn. So I knew sort of who to call around, and I finally talked to the regional director in Atlanta, and I said, well, why the Cherokee? And you know, you can tell when a bureaucrat's starting to get nervous. And he said kind of weakly, well, they were the only people who applied.
I really don't
Okay,
know.
well, if I were wanting to run a casino in Auburn, I know exactly the tribal areas that will be prime real estate. Okay?
Well, I think they're doing very well right now with the ones that they've got. Yes, sir.
So, in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned how after the Chickamauga conflict, there was a dispersal from towns where the agriculture surrounded the settlement to individual homesteads, and then there was the influx of whites through this passport program to work as ferry operators, mill operators, et cetera. But what did that do to erode the traditional, I guess, traditions of ownership of land in the Cherokee agricultural?
Well, they didn't actually own the land they were on. They had the right to declare that this is my land, and another Cherokee could be their neighbor, but they had to guarantee a greenway between these, separation. So, I mean, there wasn't this enormous population where that ever became an issue at all.
So a lot of the, I guess, communal style of ownership were able to persist even after they.
Well, they still knew that what their plans were. And they were still very traditional in some aspects, and even you will see past the removal where Cherokees come, return and they make Sandtown, a whole new town in Macon County, North Carolina, and they have a council house right there. And so, I mean, this goes on into the more modern times too. So that did not. I'm sure some things fell away because they used to have many more ceremonies, but like the bus, the green corn ceremony, it remained very important.
I know that we would love to talk to Dr. Abrams for hours. We need to move on to our final speaker, but you will be around afterward. And I'm sure we'd all love a little more time with her. Sorry, I'm gonna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Whatever that last slide was looked interesting. Okay, our final speaker today is Dr. Stuart Marshall. He is a visiting assistant professor of history at Sewanee, the University of the South. He's working on a book based on his dissertation, The Age of Junaluska, Eastern Cherokee Sovereignty in the Long Civil War Era. He's published in Early American Studies and the North Carolina Historical Review. Marshall also studies Cherokee syllabary documents as a team member of Eastern Cherokee Histories in translation. His presentation today is That Day at the Horseshoe, Junaluska, Andrew Jackson, and Eastern Cherokee Memorialization of the Creek War. Please welcome Dr. Stuart Marshall.
Thank you so much. I have to extend a special thanks to our hosts as well as the NPS folks that are with us today. And also to the other speakers for wonderful talks this morning. Some of you may not know, Dr. Peach and I share the same academic advisor, though we hadn't met till this morning, Dr. Greg O'Brien. So I think it's very, very telling of his direction that we both ended up here and hopefully delivering talks that speak to some common issues here. One of the first books that Dr. O'Brien had me read at UNCG was Dr. Abram's book, which is an essential resource for understanding the Creek War and for understanding Cherokee history. My own research area is mostly about, I'll tell you a little bit more in a second, but mostly about Junaluska and the Civil War generation of Eastern Cherokees. We cannot understand them without understanding Cherokee involvement in the Creek War. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why. So I'll start by beginning with a famous phrase, a famous quote, and spend the rest of the talk trying to unpack that and make more sense of it for you. So of all the famous figures who made their mark on Horseshoe Bend, few are as misunderstood as Junaluska. One of those Cherokee volunteers that served under General Andrew Jackson, Junaluska is best remembered for his later remarks about the betrayal he suffered on the Trail of Tears. Quote, "If I had known that Jackson would drive us from our homes, I would have killed him that day at the Horseshoe." I'm seeing some nods. Can I get a show of hands? Who has heard this quote before? Does this ring some bells? About half of us, roughly. So that's the famous quote. And certainly there's a lot of truth to it, a lot of resonance to it. But I want to unpack that for you and try to get us closer to the real Junaluska and what else he said about that day at the Horseshoe. So part of the reason we don't really know a lot about Junaluska, at least in terms of actual real fact and real detail, his story was subsumed by what we call the Age of Jackson, right? He becomes sort of a symbolic figure within that grand story. And had Junaluska killed Jackson in 1814, as he suggested, American history may indeed have turned out quite differently. And yet Junaluska was so much more than a bitter old warrior musing on hypothetical outcomes of missed opportunities. As his famous vow about Jackson suggests, Junaluska recognized his own power to shape American history, launching his own political career designed to reverse the dispossession of his people and outlast what we call the Age of Jackson. True, Junaluska told Cherokees of his scorn for the president, but he more often publicly cited his military service with the general for political capital. So Junaluska's story of sacrifice, betrayal, and dispossession was a ubiquitous and epitomizing event, borrowing from Ray Fogelson's idea of epitomizing events, an essential event, an essential episode that's always lingering in the back of people's minds. For the Eastern Cherokees, especially in North Carolina, who attempted to retain rights to their homeland and clarify their political standing there, especially around the issue of citizenship that Junaluska's story helps us understand. So this Age of Jackson, which is the more familiar story, was countered by another political history, which I call the Age of Junaluska. So there we go. We're talking today about an event that occurred in 1814, but you'll notice most of the quotes here about Junaluska and his fame, his claim to fame, are from much later. So to hit a few of these, Silas McDowell was a Macon County, North Carolina farmer who also sort of invented or really popularized a lot of different apple cultivars. I'll talk about one of those. But McDowell says we all knew and loved Junaluska, and he lived until a short time before our rebellion, referring to the Civil War, of course. Georgian living in near Dahlonega said no other chief was ever more beloved by the Cherokee Indians than Junaluska. Of course, that's up for debate, but at least in terms of the Eastern Cherokees, it rings pretty true, I would say. James Mooney, of course, some of you might be familiar with his work of ethnography among Cherokees in East and West. When talking about the Creek War, Mooney says when he interviewed Cherokees in North Carolina, the only name still remembered is that of their old chief, Junaluska, in terms of the Creek War. Whenever that subject came up, people naturally made the association with Junaluska. Fred Olds, if you've ever been to the North Carolina Museum of History, you'll know that Olds had a hand in forming that organization. He says the most famous of all the old chiefs was Junaluska. And J.P. Arthur wrote an important early history of Western North Carolina. He also reiterates this. Most importantly, and what I will end with eventually, is what Cherokees said about Junaluska. And Armstrong Cornsilk, himself a veteran of the Civil War, not the Creek War, he later gave a eulogy at Junaluska's grave in what is now Robbinsville, North Carolina. He said in the Cherokee language, this was translated. He said, "We Cherokees feel that it was through him that we have the privilege of being here today." And I think he really meant that in terms of Junaluska's political example, his example of leadership, his example of resilience, and especially the heights that he climbed to in terms of political rights, the rights of citizenship in the state of North Carolina. There we are. Now, again, separating sort of myth from history here. In terms of eyewitness accounts, we had a discussion about this, Dr. Abram. In terms of eyewitness accounts from the time of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, you're not likely to find Junaluska's name mentioned in there. Of course, he was there. He appears in the service records. Mike Wren and I were just talking about this the other day. We know he's there. But it's not until later that we really see how this fame grows throughout the course of his life. Service records indicate he's a private. Later, he gets these series of promotions, and it's been difficult to parse out how much of this is self-promotion and how much is maybe other people equating his political influence with perhaps his rank that he had held in the war. So by 1821, he's described as a captain in a petition that I'll tell you about. By 1837, he is described in North Carolina as the hero of Horseshoe Bend. By 1846, in an act of legislation passed the following year, says he distinguished himself as a commander of a body of Cherokees. In the 1850s, again, this is continued that he commanded perhaps a company. Again, a captain would be 100 or more. And then later in the 1850s, it's suggested that he saved General Jackson's army from being cut off and massacred. So there's a story eventually that maybe he turned the tide of the battle. That eventually grows into, by 1890, that he personally saved Andrew Jackson's life. Now, this is again part of the larger folklore. It's also what Johnny Cash, the version of the story that Johnny Cash tells on his TV show when he reads a story about Junaluska, that he personally saved Andrew Jackson's life. And I think that's just cut off there at the bottom. So we can see how this fame grows alongside, again, Junaluska's own political career. And one of those examples from 1858, the speaker here is William Holland Thomas, a name that will be familiar to those of you that are familiar with the history of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. But Thomas is advocating for Junaluska. Side note, Thomas also called himself Junaluska. That's a nickname that he took. But Thomas advocates for Cherokee citizenship in North Carolina. And one of the common talking points he always returns back to is that Cherokees have sacrificed much for the United States. They sacrificed much for the state of North Carolina. They've done everything that they have been asked to do through that alliance that Dr. Abram was just talking about a minute ago. And we can see here how eventually the story emerges that Junaluska is the first of those Cherokees to swim the Tohopeka and steal the Creek's canoes, cutting off any chance of retreat and leading to disaster for the Creeks that day at the Horseshoe. So, just recapping, of course, showing you the map there of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Junaluska is one of those recruits in Gideon Morgan's regiment that is stationed opposite of where Andrew Jackson is in the battle, with the artillery and the 39th U.S. Infantry on that side there. As for his name, it's there in syllabary, Sunalahunski or Junalahunski. This is another part of the story about him, is that this was his war title. Dr. Peach told you about war titles in Creek culture. Junaluska had an earlier name, Gokalaski. And this Junaluska name is the one that he earned through the battle. It roughly translates to one who tries but fails, one who didn't accomplish what he set out to do. And generally in the common story, this is thought to be related to his claim before the war that he was going to kill all of the Creeks, and he failed to do that. He gets home, there's a war dance, as they're all telling stories about the war, and it's at that dance that he gets this name. So unpacking that a little bit, we also know that the resonance of the name, as it grows, as his story grows, it has more to do with his failures to keep his land, the dispossession that he suffered in North Carolina. And we also know that it's not true that he literally tried to wipe out all of the Creeks. In one of the pension claims that he offers testimony for later, he describes a comrade of his, Cherokee comrade of his, who adopted a Creek girl, an orphan at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Of course, we know many captives are taken in the battle, but he describes this girl whose name came to be Susanna, and she's adopted into the Cherokees. She lives out the rest of her life in Buffalo Town in North Carolina. So, even before he returns home, he's already suffered a form of betrayal that Dr. Abram again hinted at, that these Cherokee volunteers have left their homes to serve alongside Jackson, and they have left their homes a bit vulnerable. And white settlers, as well as Tennessee militiamen, end up plundering a lot of Cherokee homesteads, stealing a lot of livestock and so forth. Even reports of violence and abuse with Cherokee families. But Junaluska later testifies that he had a bunch of hogs that were stolen, quote, in the year 1814, when absent in the service of the U.S. against the Creek Indians. So he sues, files a claim for compensation for the loss of those hogs, that again, while he is out there putting his life on the line, he's also being plundered by the U.S. So this is part of the broader complaints that Cherokees in what is now North Carolina, the Upper Towns area, they are making these complaints known to the federal government. They are of course, having some relationship with the state government, but for the most part now, they're hoping that the federal government can intervene in sort of these border conflicts. And Yonah Equa, or Big Bear, was one of the preeminent headmen in this part of North Carolina at the time. His land was in what is now Bryson City, North Carolina. In 1815, he writes to James Madison, and he appoints two of his headmen, George and Junaluska, to go to Washington and deliver this message, this complaint that settlers are encroaching on their lands, that although the war is over at this point, there could be an outbreak of violence, and they need desperately for some intervention here. We can see this rhetoric developed in other post-war letters. This one is Upper Town's message, I believe, to Agent Meigs. And it talks about, again, this common cause that they had together and the betrayal that they are feeling. We went off to war together. We were called on by the heads of our nation to go to the war. We went hand in hand with General Jackson and soon brought about a peace. General Jackson then told us that we need have no dread on our minds, for it was now peace. And then General Jackson told us that if we would help him in the war, that we should have more land. So they clearly associate their alliance with the U.S., their service in the Creek War, as an effort to protect their sovereignty, protect their land and property. One of the results of this, Cherokee Nation cedes more land in the treaties of 1817 and 1819, which is also the origin of many Cherokees applying to become U.S. citizens. Over 300 claimed individual reservations of 640 acres, and they were supposed to be able to hold this land as citizens of the U.S. You can see Junaluska's name there, next to Junaluska, another prominent Eastern band, before the Eastern band chief. So he is one of these people who applies for a reservation, which is meant to sort of mediate some of these land conflicts. Here is his application in the National Archives to take a reserve on Cowie River above Sugartown. So he, again, does everything he's supposed to do, follows this process. There's no, as far as I know, no record of the survey plat of his land. But he followed the proper process here to claim a reservation, and in so doing, claim U.S. citizenship. Within really a few months of claiming this land, white settlers encroach on the land, they take over his improvements, take over his house, and they run him out. He was never able to recover this land. This is what he later says in one of his claims against the U.S. And even at this time, there's an ironic sort of, on the one hand, he's being betrayed by his countrymen. On the other hand, there's growing sympathy, at least in terms of symbolism. And we see this in the form of a petition sent to the North Carolina legislature in the year 1821. They are forming a new county out of the ceded land, ceded Cherokee land. There are 2 petitions that hint at this, asking that the new county to be formed out of the Cherokee land to be named Cherokee after its original inhabitants. They also argued that the county seat be moved and that the name of Junaluska be given to the county seat. Quote, in honor to the brave chief and warrior of that name, to whom the country owes a debt of gratitude for his distinguished services as a captain in commanding the Cherokees at the Battle of the Horseshoe. 72 petitioners endorsed this name as the name for the county seat. However, by 1829, the state of North Carolina sort of breaks its promises to these Cherokee reservees. They try to essentially have a final payout to the reservees so that they relinquish all claims to their land. There's commissioners, state commissioners that are sent to the town of Franklin, really the Cherokee town of Niquosi, what's now Franklin. And they have a meeting with these Cherokee reservees who have been run out of their land and have been unable to get proper process in local courts and compensation for their lost land. And they go around and they try to offer a final payment of $50 for these people who've lost their land. If they accept the payment, they forfeit any future litigation about the land. And when they get to Junaluska, he doesn't speak English, which we can see through later sources. Not fluent in English. There's an interpreter there who seems to twist some words, but the commissioners induce him to accept the payment. He's hesitant, and they say, this is really just a gratuity. This is a tip for your military service. The government wants to honor you for your military service at Horseshoe Bend. So just accept the payment, and then we'll follow up about the land later. Multiple witnesses say that, yes, they told Junaluska this was a gratuity. It was not him forfeiting his land. So they ask him, do you think $50 is enough compensation for your land? He's hesitant. He's confused about this. He says, no, $50 is not enough. When it came to me, Junaluska, this is his later testimony. When it came to me, Junaluska, they asked me what I thought about it. He asked me how much I thought was coming to me in a payment for his land. I said $5,000, which, according to other testimony, is pretty accurate for the actual value of that land at the time. But they just wanted to accept the $50. He then eventually accepts the $50. And in so doing, again, forfeits his claim to the reservation and by extension, really citizenship within the state of North Carolina. He says, it was not explained when I signed the deed that I was signing away my reservation, or I would not have signed. So another betrayal there. This story gets turned into this later story about one of the apple cultivars that are Cherokee apples. Junaluska is one of those cultivars that is popularized by Silas McDowell, who claims he knew and loved Junaluska. You'll see the claim there for later $50 noted. But the poem on the right popularizes a common story about Junaluska, that he gave away his apple tree and he gave away his land for $50. So again, we can see how that mythology rises out of this dispossession. So after this, Junaluska multiple times tries to set up a new home. He goes west to the Valley River, living with some kinfolk over there. This is his valuation before removal that tells you a little bit what his house looked like. He also, as some claims records suggests, some that Mike sent me, describes himself as an officer of the nation, very likely a light horse officer, and he is tasked with tracking down stolen horses, stolen livestock, all this process of white settler encroachment and Cherokee attempts to police their borders, police their land. And on the eve of removal, as Cherokees are beginning to be arrested before they're forcibly immigrated, one military officer recorded seeing Junaluska at Fort Butler. And he says he's part of a group of, quote, citizens of North Carolina who had been brought in by mistake. They included children and relatives of Junaluska on whose behalf he, as well as the white men, some of his local allies, urged me to make some recommendations to the general. Junaluska again persuasively argued for his role at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the idea that he should not be betrayed, his military service should not be forgotten. Quote, Junaluska said that he had acted a conspicuous part in the Old Creek War, especially in the Battle of the Horseshoe, and he did not know what he had done, that the whites should wish to get rid of him. He said that Jackson told him if he would fight good, he would give him a mile square of land, but he would forego the land if they would allow him to remain. The female part of his family were in tears at separating with their kinsfolk. So again, even though he's a popular figure, he's still suffering the early parts of the Trail of Tears. 1837, there's renewed interest in creating the county seat, naming it Junaluska, after the hero of the Battle of the Horseshoe, even as the state is making preparations to forcibly remove him. Also at the same time, this is where a lot of the story, the folklore and mythologies get twisted up and confused. There's this novel that comes out called Junaluska, the Cherokee Chief, A Tale of Past Wars, which is sort of a James Fenimore Cooper style telling of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Creek War from a Cherokee perspective, written by a white North Carolinian. It confuses the names Junaluska and Junaluska, who are, of course, very influential early leaders of Eastern Cherokees before the Eastern Band. But at this point, Junaluska sort of, again, those names are mashed up. And in this case, Junaluska, who did not fight in the war, they're sort of combined and made one character in this telling of the battle, where it describes them, they bore off every canoe like so many water moccasins swimming the Tohopeka. So, of course, we know that Junaluska reversed his Trail of Tears. He lost his wife and his daughters. They died on the Trail of Tears, certainly extended kin as well. By the early 1840s, he returns to North Carolina, and he begins again setting a new path for his own political career. In a claims record, he briefly says, I stayed in the West 4 years, came back 2 years ago, maybe 4 winters, but he makes his way back to North Carolina. And one of the earlier indications of this is William Holland Thomas sends a message to Congress, again arguing for Cherokee citizenship rights in the state, those Cherokees who have been successful at avoiding removal and remain in the state. Thomas writes to Congress, he says, I saw the chief of the outlying Indians a short time since. He's an old man, upwards of 70 years of age, and he had evidence of his friendship to the whites, several Creeks scalps taken by him at the Battle of the Horseshoe. He informs me he designs on settling on the unappropriated lands of the state, and that he and his people have money enough to supply their wants in purchasing corn for the present. Junaluska's return, as well as his military service, is frequently included in Cherokee petitions to the state. This example is from 1843. There's an English portion, as well as a syllabary portion. And some of my colleagues at Western Carolina are going to help me tackle this to arrive at a translation of this piece. But the English version has a very romantic depiction of Cherokee service in the Creek War, reminding the state that they ought to honor these people and do well by them. It has a description that begins, the Creeks had held the war talk and lifted the tomahawk against the whites. The great war chief, General Jackson, sent runners to the Cherokee towns, desiring the swift-footed warriors to join him. The trumpet of the war chief had sounded, and soon a large body of Cherokees were seen marching under the flag to the battle in the bend of the river, resembling a horseshoe. They were told now to prove whether the Cherokees will stand by their white brothers in the hour of danger. The war chief sounded the signal for battle, nearby the war whoop of the Creeks. At length, the Cherokees, who was stationed on the opposite side of the river, could not stand to see Creeks behind the breastwork, and some of the Cherokees' chiefs swam the river, took the canoes of the Creeks, in which the whole company was soon conveyed over. This soon ended the battle. A part of the chiefs who held the above council at that battle and swam the river after the canoes of the Creeks, one of these old chiefs, remaining in the east, has paid his old war chief many visits at his residence at the Hermitage in Tennessee, and always receives the kind reception due to an old worn-out warrior who slew 6 Creeks himself. So a reference to the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's house in Tennessee, and this sort of romanticized version of very likely Junaluska visiting him, although he's not named in the petition. So later in the 1840s, Junaluska's active involvement and lobbying for some kind of compensation, some kind of honoring of his military service, and a reversal of his earlier dispossession. He actively lobbies for this. He has some friends on his side. He quite literally lobbies for it in the state legislature in December 1846. He's spotted around Raleigh, waiting for this act to pass that grants him the next year, grants him citizenship, explicit recognition of all of the rights of citizenship in the state of North Carolina, as well as a land grant intended to compensate him for the loss of his earlier reservation. And of course, the legislative act here, it reiterates the story about Horseshoe Bend. He's distinguished himself in the service of the U.S. at the Battle of the Horseshoe as commander of a body of Cherokees, as well as on diverse other occasions during the last war with Great Britain. And we have a record through newspapers of a speech that he delivered in the Cherokee language before the legislature, thanking them. This is the closest thing that we have. The interpreter was George W. Hayes. And he says in his youth, at the age of 33, he had joined the white people, and that in his youth he had helped them to win their battles. And as he had fought for the white man in his youth and manhood, so the white man had been good and kind to him in his old age. So he offers his thanks to the state legislature. He is enrolled in the 1850 census. See his name there and his occupation listed as farmer Indian. And he then sets about doing pension work for some of his late comrades and their families, their widows. A lot of these are in the Thomas papers at Duke. And he recalls with detail his military service. He never says, I was a captain, for the record, but he recalled with detail that he served upwards of 4 months in the war under the command of Colonel Morgan, Captain Spears, and Major Walker. And many of his late comrades left heirs entitled to pensions. Another document, Captain Junaluska, is listed as remembering that one of his comrades was in the war with him against the Creeks. Another fought by his side. Another named Lowen, who was with him under the immediate command of Colonel Gideon Morgan, he says, had been wounded in the Battle of the Horseshoe. Junaluska bolstered these claims with his reputation as a respectable Indian of Buffalo Town who was citizenized under the laws of North Carolina. The story again grows in the North Carolina University magazine later in the 1850s. The account seems to suggest that somebody interviewed Junaluska before writing this, and it talks about sort of his recollections of fighting in the battle, and again reiterates the idea that he inspired this charge that decided the fate of the battle. One interesting detail, in his own language, he said he drew a bead on many a creek, a bead of the rifle sight. Wounded in the shoulder during the Horseshoe engagement. Another interesting detail from this source. So, he also appears in some other newspapers later in the 1850s. One of these, he has just been to Columbia, South Carolina to attend court because he has heard that his grandniece, who is abducted during removal and enslaved for 14 years, she's been found in South Carolina. He goes there bringing testimony with him that she was abducted when she was 4 years old and enslaved. And he makes an appearance in court. People recognize him again as the hero of the Battle of the Horseshoe. So he lends credibility to her case, and she is freed. There's a lot more to that case that I won't go into today. On his way out of South Carolina, he's preparing to go to Washington City. He's spotted in Greenville, South Carolina, waiting by the train station just after Christmas, headed there up in the new year. And when asked which of the engagements he was in whilst with Jackson, he simply replied by making a half circle with the finger of one hand in the palm of the other, a horseshoe shape. And as he did so, a tear glistened in his jet black eye, whilst a smile played upon his countenance. So he is then on his way to Washington by January 1855 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the end of the War of 1812. There are festivities celebrating Jackson's victories, including New Orleans, and he is recognized in the capital city. I'm happy to announce the presence of Junaluska, alias Junaluska, one of the old veterans of 1812. And the hotel he stays in was one frequented by a lot of native diplomats in Washington. And supposedly there were two busts, I guess marble busts, one of Andrew Jackson, one of Henry Clay. And there's a famous quote that Jackson, one of his great regrets was that he didn't kill Henry Clay when he had a chance. So Junaluska is probably thinking the same thing when he saw that bust of Jackson there. Again, Junaluska does not speak English, but the journalist sees him look at the Jackson bust and thinks he's having a fond memory of his old commander, right? But Junaluska looks at Jackson, makes a motion of shooting, and says, supposedly good, much good. Again, thinking about his original quote that I began with, of he wished he had killed Jackson that day. So moving along, this is my personal, Mike Wren actually asked me, what was my needle in the haystack or one of my favorite finds in the archives? This one blew a lot of stuff out of the water when I found this one. While in Washington to celebrate the end of the War of 1812, 40th anniversary, Junaluska and his nephew, judging by the handwriting here, prepared this petition to the state of North Carolina. And I'll read it for you here. There's a threat for legislation back in North Carolina to amend the Constitution of the state, which would explicitly define suffrage as exclusively the right of white men. Junaluska says, the undersigned memorialists respectfully request and ask the attention of your honorable bodies. Having learned that a proposed amendment of the Constitution of your state in extending free suffrage to your citizens for electing senators to your legislature, the proposed amendment, as I understand it, disfranchises me of my rights as a citizen of your state, a subject of the same, and to her laws, guaranteed unto me at a previous session of your legislature. Your memorialist would humbly request of your honorable bodies that you will remember your old friend, one of the old veterans of 1812, who fought in behalf of the United States against the Creek Indians. And I hope you will regard and not pass any laws that will take away or abridge my rights as a citizen guaranteed unto me as aforesaid. So he's in Washington to celebrate, again, commemorate the end of the war. And he gets some news from home, tries to make, again, his mark on state law. Unfortunately, I think this trip was more or less his last hurrah. His health begins to decline after he returns home. But if there's any question about whether or not he actually exercised his rights as a citizen, we have some good evidence of that. In an exchange in the Congressional Globe between Sam Houston of Texas and Thomas Clingman of North Carolina, they're trying to clarify what Cherokee rights are in the state. Houston is under the impression that all the Cherokees living in North Carolina are all citizens. Clingman says it's not really that simple. There never was more than one given the privilege of citizenship, and he had rendered good service in the war. Houston asks, do they not vote at your elections? Klingman says, none other than the one I refer to, Junaluska. Thomas, William Holland Thomas, again refers to this. He talks about Horseshoe once again. He talks about Junaluska's declining health. He'll enjoy that honor and those privileges but a little longer. The privilege of voting for members of the Senate, he can never again exercise. The great physical strength of the warrior is gone. He is no longer able to attend the election precinct to vote, no longer able to go to his precinct. The time of his death, his land is sold off. Even in the advertisement for the sale of that land, it again recalls his service in the War of 1812. And trying to wrap things up here, by the time of the Civil War, Cherokees in North Carolina were still in limbo in terms of their rights of citizenship. So when war comes to them once again, they very naturally turn to the one name of the famous warrior who had explicit recognition of his rights of citizenship, and as the evidence suggests, actually exercise his right to vote. And they form a volunteer company even before North Carolina seceded. So this is just for state defense at this point, but they call it the Junaluska Zouaves. And of course, there is something overtly political behind that name choice. And who else would lead them and recruit this battalion of North Carolina Cherokees but the son of Colonel Gideon Morgan? Colonel Morgan of the Creek War, who led the Cherokee Volunteers at the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend, married a Cherokee woman. They have several very influential children, one of whom is Major Wash Morgan, also known as Aconostota Morgan or Ogunstode, after his Cherokee ancestor. And I'll give you the words of one Tennessee historian at the time, J.G.M. Ramsey, who that name might be familiar to some of us, earlier historian of Tennessee, but also a secessionist at this time. He endorses this plan for Morgan to recruit a battalion of Cherokees from North Carolina. He says they were thirsting for an opportunity to prove themselves not unworthy descendants of Aconostota and other braves of their tribe. They are represented to me as loyal to the South and subordinate in war to their chiefs and headmen. They are especially devoted to the name of Morgan, one of whom the late Colonel Gideon Morgan led them at the Battle of the Horseshoe and the Muckfall against their ancient enemies, the Creeks. And he thinks that Major Morgan here can make out of their young men a reliable auxiliary force in the present war. I'm out of time, I believe, so I really want to skip ahead with this final note, again from Cherokees themselves. Armstrong Cornsilk, who rededicates the grave of Junaluska in 1910. He says, "We appreciate his going to war, gaining the big victory for Jackson. We Cherokees feel that it was through him that we have the privilege of being here today. He was a good man, a good friend. He would ask the hungry man to eat. He would ask the cold one to warm by his fire. He would ask the tired one to rest. He was a smart man. He was very brave. He was not afraid." Thank you.
Have any questions for Dr. Marshall?
Yes.
What's happened to his remaining descendants?
So the name Junaluska, both as a first name and a surname, is still very popular in the Eastern Band today. So some of them are still in his old area in Snowbird. Yeah.
Did you find strong feelings about him or his memory from other indigenous groups at the time? How is he regarded by Creeks, for example?
That's a fascinating question. I have not encountered any evidence of that. Perhaps he's not as fondly remembered among the Creeks, but I would be interested to see if maybe there are any Creek sources on that. And thank you all for your patience. I'm happy to take questions after. We can talk in the hall. I don't want to keep anyone late.
Is this my fault?
Oh, no, you're good.
Anybody else? Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for attending our symposium this year, today. This concludes the speakers, but they will be here around in case you have any other questions you didn't want to ask in front of the group. I want to say again, thank you so much to Pebble Hill, to Auburn University, to the Caroline John Center for Arts and Humanities, Dr. Wilson, the Friends of Horseshoe Bend, and all of you for being here today. Thanks.